Dredge is one of the most powerful and meta-warping decks in all of Vintage, and it requires specific sideboarding and hate pieces to beat it. But how do you know which ones to use? When do you want Leyline of the Void, and when do you want Pithing Needle? I'll tell you everything you need to know about combating Dredge in this episode of Voice of Vintage. Okay, welcome back, Vintage Gamers, to the newest episode of Voice of Vintage. Today, we are going over Dredge sideboarding. Why do players choose to use the different sideboard cards they do? When do they make sense? And what do you need for your deck? Today, I have brought up here a list of pretty commonly used sideboard cards and a bunch of different types of sideboard cards. And we're going to go over why they're used, when they're used, and how they actually interact with Dredge. So on the right side of your screen, I have some couple placeholder cards, but this big major column is all of the Dredge interaction pieces you're likely to come across. Because Dredge is a mulligan to Bazaar of Baghdad deck, because Dredge doesn't use mana to cast spells, it has very few options when it comes to what kind of interaction it has. And that is going to highly affect what types of cards are good versus it. So we're going to start here by talking about the different zones and ways you can interact with Dredge. So Dredge, at its core, is mulliganing to this Bazaar of Baghdad card. This is the key piece to starting your graveyard engine. So you have this Bazaar of Baghdad in play. This Bazaar of Baghdad is a land. It has an activated ability. You can only use it once per turn. All of these things factor in to a way that you can combat Dredge. You can attack Bazaar of Baghdad. Now, at the core, Dredge almost entirely will be using the combat phase and creatures to deal 20 damage to you. It's almost, in a sense, an aggro deck. Putting creatures into play and attacking is how it wins. This is another way you can combat Dredge. You can either remove the creatures, stop the creatures from entering play, or stop the opponent from attacking with the creatures. All of those are options. Now, that is not the only way Dredge is dealing damage these days. We do know that the graveyard has some options here. The biggest one is Creeping Chill. So Creeping Chill is a trigger from when this card is put into your graveyard from your library, and it deals 3 to each opponent, and they gain 3 life. So this is a way that Dredge players can get around the fact that they are primarily using creatures and combat. This is going to put, this is going to not be counterable by counter spells, and this is a graveyard-based way of dealing damage. There are a few other options here, but we'll go over those at the very end. We're going to look at mostly the primary Dredge lists used right now in 2026 and what ways they can be combated. So I'm going to leave this Bazaar in play, and let's talk about different ways of stopping Bazaar of Baghdad. It's important to know that stopping Bazaar of Baghdad after it's activated once is different and higher value than stopping Bazaar of Baghdad before it gets activated. One of the most absolute common cards you will see at stopping Bazaar of Baghdad from being activated is Needle. Needle enters the battlefield, choose a card, and that card can't be activated. Needle has a lot of upsides. It is cheap. It is 1 mana artifact. So every deck, and it's colorless, so every deck can play this, and every deck can play this. And if you are on the play, playing this before opponent plays a Bazaar of Baghdad means they will never get their graveyard engine going. This is a very powerful piece. It can also be found off of Urza Saga's Tutor, or card like Tezzeret, Cruel Captain. That card can tutor for this as well. It's worth noting that a Bazaar of Baghdad played before a Needle and activated before a Needle can put a Dredger in the graveyard, and from there, use draw steps and dredges and not have to activate a Bazaar of Baghdad again. Now, that doesn't mean that a Needle on the draw is useless. It's going to greatly slow down your opponent when they can't use multiple dredges every turn. And it's also going to stop the opponent from being able to put the cards they dredge back into their yard very easily. So it's got some timings that are important. There are weaknesses to Needle besides timing. So Needle is a card that is a spell. It's an artifact. So as a spell, it gets put on the stack, and as an artifact, it can be countered by Force of Will, Force of Negation, Mind Break Trap. If it's on the draw, it can be taken by Grief. And if it's in play, because it's an artifact or enchantment, it can be destroyed by Force of Vigor. So all of Dredge's interaction suite that does not specifically go for creatures or return cards from the yard interacts and is ready to beat Needle, because Needle is one of the most common ways to combat Bazaar. There are more ways to combat Bazaar, different cards that have a similar effect to Needle. Sorcerer's Spyglass, those kind of cards. But you can also use Wasteland. Wasteland attacks Bazaar after Bazaar has already been activated once. So Wasteland is kind of like having a Needle, but on the draw. Now, Wasteland itself is combated by a different piece of hate. So obviously, Wasteland, unlike Needle, doesn't go on the stack. So Force of Will, Force of Negation, Mind Break Trap, Grief, all of these cards don't actually interact with Wasteland in a favorable way. So what Dredge does is they have Noxious Revival. Noxious Revival, after your Bazaar has been Wastelanded, you can put that Bazaar back on the top of your library, opt to not Dredge for one draw step, and bring back Bazaar. Now, Noxious Revival, on the other hand, does go on the stack. So this can be combated by opponent's counter magic. So there's a little bit of a push and pull there, depending on what you're trying to do. So there you go. This is a couple primary examples of ways of stopping Bazaar and stopping the engine itself from getting started. But there are multiple other paths here. So everyone knows that Dredge and the Dredge mechanic is you're putting this in here, and you are substituting a draw step to put cards directly from your library into your graveyard. And while cards are in your graveyard, various things will happen. Dredging over Icarids means they're going to return on your upkeep into play. Dredging over Narcomoebas might help return prized amalgams. You might dredge over Creeping Chills and drain your opponent, and so on and so forth. And so a very straightforward way of combating Dredge is stopping the graveyard. And now there are going to be multiple avenues here of stopping the graveyard and multiple timing windows to think about. And we're going to go over a bunch of commonly used graveyard attacking cards and what are their strengths and weaknesses. So, Leyline of the Void. That's probably your number one anti-Dredge card. It enters the play before Bazaar even comes down and makes it so your opponent is not going to be able to use the graveyard as long as it is in play. What is the strengths of Leyline? Well, Leyline, because it is this opening game effect, does not go on the stack. So it is not combated by Force of Will. It is not combated by Force of Negation, by Mind Break Trap, by Grief. The only way that Leyline is currently attacked is with Force of Vigor, killing the Leyline, or with Hollow One just being cast because it doesn't actually care about the graveyard itself and attacking through Leyline. So there are only two real ways to beat and attack this Leyline of the Void. The downside of Leyline of the Voids is quite high because it is a 4-mana enchantment. It cannot be played in any decks that contain Lurrus as a companion. That's not exactly true. You can play this card in your Lurrus companion sideboard, except you will not be able to use your Lurrus as a companion when you bring this in. And you'll actually see that sometimes. You'll see blue-black Lurrus decks choose to play Leyline of the Void, even though it doesn't play well with the Lurrus. The other major problem with Leyline is it has to be, for the most part, in your opening hand to be effective. If you are drawing this card on any other turn, it's a 4-mana enchantment. It's going to be very hard to play before your opponent gets ahead of you. And it kind of results in a bunch of dead draws in your deck. You'll hear a lot of people talk about mulliganing to Leyline. It's going to be a lot about, if this is your primary way of combating Dredge, you're going to be very heavily focused in your mulliganing phase on Leyline. So you have Leyline here. That's a one way and a very common way, especially for non-Lurrus decks, to attack the graveyard portion of Bazaar. There are lots of other ways. You have different kinds of one-time use effects, and these one-time use effects have various levels of potency depending on how much of the yard they're hitting. If you are a green-based deck, you might play this Endurance. Endurance is a way to put all the cards that were in the yard back into the library. It doesn't exile them, so that's a downside. But it's a creature, so it has some versatility in other matchups, but you also have to play other green cards to use this card. Kind of a narrow one. Ravenous Trap. Ravenous Trap is one of the more powerful generic graveyard hate cards. So this one is, if the opponent has put 3 or more cards in the graveyard from anywhere this turn, it actually only costs 0 and exile target graveyard. So how does this help and how does this hurt? Well, this card has positives and negatives on its timing windows. If your opponent knows about the trap and wants to play around the trap, they have leeway to dredge smaller amounts, natural dredge on the draw step, and then activate Bazaar later or in response. Because this goes on the stack, you have that kind of timing issue. One of the nice parts about Ravenous Trap is maybe it doesn't get hit by negation as often because you're going to typically be Ravenous Trapping on your opponent's turn. However, if if you're maybe being a little sly about it, you can maybe activate Bazaar at different timing windows to play around your opponent's interaction and these kind of things. So maybe you want to activate Bazaar on your opponent's turn as the Dredge player so that you can use your negation to protect you from trap. Again, one of the things here is exile target's graveyard only if 3 or more cards got put in the yard. Now, for the most part, Dredge is always going to have 3 cards go in the yard, and that's pretty much always happening. However, there are other Bazaar decks in the format called like Countervine, which sometimes has cards that when they get madnessed, they don't actually ever hit the yard, and you can't actually trigger trap. So if you're only bringing this card in for Dredge, it's always going to be pretty strong, though it's going to have to go on the stack. But if there are other decks in the metagame, it might not always be the right choice. Another thing is because this requires 3 cards to hit the yard, and you have to wait for that to happen, Grief is a little bit more powerful against Ravenous Trap on turn 1. But Grief's a little less powerful against Ravenous Trap later because if they want to maximize their Bazaar activations, they typically are going to activate in the upkeep before you have a chance to Grief. So this card is really strong, but it's typically at strongest when people don't expect it. Once people know that you may or may not have Ravenous Traps, then the Dredge player has a lot of leeway to play around it. You won't see too many Surgical Attractions in Vintage. That has floated in and out of Vintage over its history. Typically, if you can get more value from the Surgical in that it's like good against some other matchups, or you're playing like a Young Pyromancer style, rewarded for playing spells effect, that's when you might want a Surgical Extraction. But this is a pretty premier anti-graveyard card in other formats. Why is it not good against Dredge? And the answer is because there are just so many pieces of Dredge that inside of Dredge that surgically extracting one part of the Dredge deck is typically not going to get the job done. You obviously have the ability, maybe if you like have your Wasteland as a way to combat the Bazaar, that you could surgical your opponent's Bazaars and then they won't have that. But that typically requires a Bazaar to have been in play and removed first. And at that point, they might already have Dredgers in their yard and they don't actually need the Bazaar. You're just slowing them down. If you hit, say, all the Icarids, that's certainly going to make it harder for the opponent to bring cards back from the yard, or if you hit all the Narcomoebas. But like I said, these cards kind of double up as that comes out from the graveyard, triggering Prized Amalgam. And so they have that kind of redundancy. There's not really a single point of failure. And that's what makes the Dredge decks of 2026 and recent memory quite strong, is that you might be able to attack their whole yard, but there's still something like a hollow one coming. And so Surgical Extraction, typically doesn't see as much play as something like a Rab Trap or a Leyline of the Void because of its narrow use. Same goes for a Fairy Macabre. This kind of card is going to excel when there's only 1 or 2 specific cards in the yard. Maybe they're trying to reanimate that kind of card. Doesn't really make a lot of sense versus Dredge. I'm going to skip over a couple of these here and go straight to a Rest in Peace. This is a card you very seldom see in Vintage. Why do you very seldom see this Rest in Peace? It's a very strong card. Enters the battlefield, exiles the graveyards, and then it does that Leyline of the Void effect afterwards. Why doesn't Rest in Peace see a lot of play? And the reason is because it costs 2 mana. 2 mana is not a high number, but when your opponent is, on the play, activating Bazaar, and you're facing down the ability for them to have creatures start entering the battlefield and coming in and threatening you as early as the second turn, if you don't have the Moxen to play this Rest in Peace on turn 1, it's frequently going to come down too slow. Now, that's not to say all 2 mana cards are not usable versus Dredge. You just need to typically augment them either with a ton of fast mana or some 1 mana cards to like bridge the gap to them. So you have that Rest in Peace attacking the whole yard. You have a couple other cards here that attack the whole yard. Tormod's Crypt, really powerful, 0, and then 1 clear the yard effect. So why would you maybe use Tormod's Crypt compared to Ravenous Trap? And the answer is maybe you care about artifacts. This card comes into play off of Urza's Saga. This card might give you Metalcraft for something like Opal. But when you look at Tormod's Crypt and you look at Trap, these cards are like good against different things. Where Ravenous Trap, in terms of Dredge interaction, Ravenous Trap might play better against Grief on the draw or something, or on the play, whereas like this Tormod's Crypt is very good against Grief when the Tormod's Crypt is on the play, but the Tormod's Crypt dies to Force of Vigor. The Tormod's Crypt can get negated, whereas the Ravenous Trap might be able to play around negation a little bit. So you have that kind of push and pull of, what section of the Dredge interaction is this card good against? Another thing to mention here is that this card returns with Lurrus. So it's more common to see this card played in decks that have that ability, but not, impossible. Like maybe your Oath deck might want to play Ravenous Traps or Leylines more than your Lurrus deck might want to play Tormod's Crypts more. And from there, you have different kinds of artifacts that clear the yard. The 2 ones you commonly see are going to be Soul Guide Lantern. So this one has, crack and exile your opponent's graveyard. Also can draw a card. Also, when it ETBs, get 1 card from your opponent's yard. And you have Spellbomb. When would you use Spellbomb and when would you use Lantern? This is not a simple question and has a lot to do with different players and preferences and decks. One of the most powerful parts of this Lantern is its double activate. When it enters, it exiles a card from the yard, and then when you activate, it exiles a card from the yard. It almost serves against Dredge specifically as 2 pieces of hate. Now, we talked about Fairy Macabre not being enough because it doesn't clear enough cards, but 1 exile from a graveyard card and the ability to clear the whole yard can result in multiple turns of slowing your opponent down. Why is that? Well, if they have 1 Dredger in their yard and you play a Lantern, you clear out all the Dredgers, and they'll have to activate Bazaar and get another Dredger back in their yard. If you hit with your 1 Soul Guide Lantern, you hit an Icarid, it's going to remove one of their ways to return creatures from their graveyard. They need to use Icarid or Narcomoeba to come back from the yard to bring cards like Prize Amalgam back into play. Same goes for using Creeping Chill to bring the Ghoul back from the yard that cares about gaining life. So the Creeping Chill you're not going to hit with the Soul Guide Lantern's first activation. Neither will you hit Narcomoeba, but you can hit Icarid and you can hit single Dredgers. So it's a conditionally 1.5 activates of the graveyard. So a typical thing you'll see maybe is just Lantern will come in, it will get rid of Icarid, and then you get to leave this Lantern in play, and then when your opponent dredges and finally hits a set of dredges that have to be cleared, then you can get the whole yard with your Soul Guide Lantern. Both of these cards, Nihil Spellbomb and Lantern, you'll see more play than Crypt because these cards have uses outside of just the Dredge matchup. Being able to cantrip will make these cards better in matchups where the graveyard doesn't matter as much. And very specifically, this Nihil Spellbomb for black decks is going to give you, always give you that extra card if you have the black mana, where this one, Soul Guide Lantern, you're choosing whether you want to draw or you want to exile your opponent's yard. So, like, you won't be able to play the Nihil Spellbomb in decks that don't have the black mana. But if you do have the black mana, this might be more useful, especially against non-dredge decks that you will always be able to draw that extra card. Whereas this one might be more useful if you're versing dredge, or you're versing someone that has where you get extra value from the multiple interactions. This has some uses in the non-dredge matchups where maybe you're taking a card that can be returned with Luris from your opponent's Luris. So you can take that card away and then still draw a card instead. So lots of nuance here in when and which decks can use these cards and when you want to use these cards. It's worth noting that because these cards are 1-drops and 0-drops, they can be artifacts that can be found off of Urza's Saga. But also because these cards are 1-drop artifacts, they can get hit by Mental Misstep. That's another piece of interaction I didn't pull up over here, but it's another card that Dredge has to combat. Very frequently some of the most powerful anti-dredge cards are 1-mana artifacts. So having Mental Misstep and having Force of Vigor and having Force of Negation can be really big boons here. Worth noting that all of these cards have an activated timing window. So if your opponent doesn't have a very large yard yet, say you're on the play and you play these preemptively, if you play these cards preemptively, they can get Force of Vigor to end of turn. However, if you play these cards reactively, they can get griefed out of your hand. So it's all about doing calculations, seeing what's the more likely thing that your opponent's going to have as terms of interaction, and making the best go of it. If you wait longer on these, they're more likely for your opponent to find blue card in negation. And you have to be aware that, especially for these ones that cost mana, like Rest in Peace and Lantern, you don't really want to play them as your third spell. You don't even want to play them as your second spell because of Mindbreak Trap. Why don't you want to play them as your second spell? Let's say you go, my turn is, you go Island, Pearl, Rest in Peace to beat your opponent. Say your opponent forces your Rest in Peace, and you force back, now Trap is online. So that's another clear example of why these 2-mana cards can be a little bit more problematic. That same problem runs into if you go Mox, land, play Rest in Peace, opponent goes to the end of turn and vigors your Rest in Peace, then you can't really safely counter back without having Mindbreak Trap online. So all of these sequences and all of these cases are what you need to do as someone playing against Dredge is think about the different forms of interaction that your opponent is registering and make the best choice based on the likelihood of them having which pieces of interaction. There are a couple other cards that attack the yard but don't clear the yard right away. Now, what are those? Well, we have Grafdigger's Cage. This one is a very powerful one, but also a very unique one in that the yard can keep growing and keep being filled. Things just can't come out of it that are creatures. So what does that mean? Well, this Grafdigger's Cage in play is going to stop things like Narcomoeba and Icarid, but it's not going to stop things like people casting Hollow One, or Creeping Chills being milled over, or creatures that are already in play. And so playing a Grafdigger's Cage is all about timing. If you have this in play, it's all about timing and health. And when you put this in play, what are your ways your opponent can attack? Because we talked about, right? Bazaar is playing in the graveyard, Bazaar is playing on the battlefield, and Bazaar is playing with the Creeping Chills, right? So this is Grafdigger's Cage. It does it that way. You also have creatures that stop things from entering. So Yixid Jailer is probably the most powerful in that cards in graveyard lose all abilities. So this, when you play this, the Dredge isn't going to happen. You're not going to have Creeping Chills come into play. You're not going to have Narcomoeba come into play. You have more cards covered than the Grafdigger's Cage. However, this is a creature, and it costs 2 mana. So creatures get a bonus where they can't be countered by Force of Negation. They can't be blown up by Force of Vigor. But because they're 2 mana, they are more likely to get griefed. And because they're creatures, there are different forms of sideboard cards that Dredge can bring in to attack them. You have cards like Contagion and Sickening Shoal that can kill creatures. So I think in general, because they don't get hit by Negation and Vigor, they are a little bit more sturdy when they do go on the stack and resolve. But if your opponent is prepared as the Dredge player, they can have answers that destroy creatures. The other creature of note here is Containment Priest, a white creature. This one has Flash, which gives you a little bit more versatility. You can wait until your opponent has gone into dredging before using Containment Priest, and once your opponent has gone into dredging, then you put the Containment Priest into play in response to some of these return triggers, and you can get extra value that way. Of course, both of these creatures here are examples of cards that can be returned with Lurrus, so you'll have a little bit more power if these are within your Lurrus deck. And so these are all solid answers to what the graveyard is doing. But one of the problems with some of these cards, especially cards that aren't like Leyline of the Void that enter right away, is what if they come down after your opponent already has creatures in play? If your opponent already has creatures in play, these kind of answers don't do anything. So what you'll see is people will sometimes leave in different removal spells. You might see some Source of Plowshares to help pick up straggling creatures. One of the primary examples of a creature coming from Dredge is this Hollow One, right? We talked about how, a Containment Priest isn't going to stop a Hollow One. A Hollow One is being cast. Grafdigger's Cage isn't going to stop a Hollow One. A bunch of these different cards that interact with the graveyard itself aren't going to stop a Hollow One. So against Dredge, you might have to keep in some removal spells, or you might opt for stopping this Hollow One from being cast entirely. This is a creature. It goes on the stack. I could counter this Hollow One. I can counter that with a Force, or I could play a card like Vexing Bauble or like Void Mirror. Some people might play like a Trinisphere or other cards that make cards cost more mana. And in that route, you are going to attack your opponent's ability to play spells. And it's a really weird split because Hollow One goes on the stack and all of their interaction go on the stack. But then if they already have cards in the yard that dredge, those cards aren't affected by a Vexing Bauble, right? So a lot of the time, you're going to have to mix and match and pair these cards with each other. You want to stop your opponent from playing spells, but you also might need to be able to clear the yard. You also might need to be maybe able to stop the attackers. How do we stop the attackers? So like I said, removal might work for some attackers, but what if they have a large number of attackers? You'll see some people play Tabernacle at the Pendrell Vale. This is a land, a colorless land that you can just play in any deck, and it will make it so your opponent has to pay an upkeep cost for every creature they have. And typically, this Bazaar deck is not going to have a lot of mana. Most of the time, it's going to have no mana. Not all the time, to be fair, but most of the time. So what this Tabernacle is going to do, if your opponent, Dredge opponent puts a wide board in play of creatures, you're going to be able to wipe out all of those creatures. Now, this doesn't cover everything. Like we've said, this Dredge deck has multifacets and multiple ways of going around narrow pieces of hate. And so while this Tabernacle might clean up Hollow Ones and Prized Amalgams and Narcomoebas, it doesn't clean up Icarids coming into play on each turn after this trigger has already gone, after the upkeep has already happened. And it doesn't cover Creeping Chills coming through the graveyard and hitting you via their triggered ability. So that's why, this is just a tool. It's not a one piece covers everything. You'll see one of the newer pieces of tech, some people are playing Over Encumbered. So Over Encumbered is an aura where you enchant your opponent and you give them a bunch of artifacts that could be removed if you had the ability to, pay 2 and crack your clue, crack your food. But typically this Bazaar deck doesn't have access to mana and it can't remove the artifacts. Because it can't remove the artifacts, it has a propaganda style effect where your Dredge opponent has to pay mana for each artifact they control, and if they can't do that, creatures can't attack. So you see these kind of effects, and Over Encumbered is the most common one, but there have been others in the history of Vintage. People have played Peacekeeper, Propaganda, that kind of card that stops the opponent's attack phase. And by doing so, Dredge can't win with the Hollow Ones or with the Icarids, so we're covering the Icarids this time, but they can still win with Creeping Chills. And of course, any kind of interaction you bring in has some set of answers. If you are bringing in Tabernacle, well, the Dredge player might bring in Wasteland as a way to answer your Tabernacle. They might also bring in cards like Riftstone Portal that make their Bazaar tap for mana, or they might have some lands of their own that can pay for some number of the creatures. And then, of course, Over Encumbered, this is Expel. It goes on the stack. It can get negated. It can get forced. It can get trapped. one of the nice parts about an over-encumbered is you kind of typically, the play pattern is you'll play it after opponents already started dredging and they've used a lot of cards. And so maybe they won't have that kind of interaction. But of course, at the end of the day, it's an enchantment and Force of Vigor can hit it. So all these cards that you bring in have reactions and counteractions to them. And what you're going to notice over, through this video is that there's not really a one-size-fits-all answer. Even if you stop the graveyard, your opponent can still play a hollow one. Even if you stop the bazaar, opponent can pitch to hand size and they can still do dredge. Even if you stop the attack phase, your opponent can still creeping chill. And so what you'll see, especially in decks that have the ability to churn through cards or tutor, is you're going to play a combination of different kinds of dredge hate that cover these various avenues. So you're going to play a needle in your deck, especially you have a Saga deck. What you're going to want to do is play a card that stops bazaar, play a card that stops the graveyard, play a card that stops the creatures, and maybe sprinkle in, some over-the-top haymakers like that kind of over-encumbered or Yixid Jailer. Even when you're doing something like playing Not Luris and you're bringing in, maybe you have 4 Leylines of the Void, you might still play a Tabernacle as your 5th piece so that, you're covering your graveyard, but you also are still going to cover that hollow one plan B. Or maybe you're going to leave in a couple Swords to Plowshares or Braids or what have you that can deal with hollow ones in a more generic way. And it's all about that push and pull in terms of timing and in terms of how your cards interact with your opponent's hate. So maybe it makes sense that you have a card, like a Containment Priest, which is good against negation and vigor. And then you also have cards that are good against grief. And you want to maybe mix and match. And this isn't always the case, but this is certainly the case, especially when like I said, you have cards that, you have demonic tutors, you have vampiric tutors. Those cards will give you more versatility in how you interact with Dredge. It might make sense that you have a variety of cards at different mana costs and timing windows. When you are tutoring for, if you're casting Demonic Tutor, that's a 2 mana card, you might need to be able to tutor for a 0-drop like a Ravenous Trap or a Tormod Script because you won't be able to play a card like Cage or Needle. And like I said, if you're on the draw, maybe this Needle is too slow. And maybe if you play Cage, your opponent already has creatures in play. So maybe you want to have access to that over-encumber to deal with the creatures. And so it's all about speed, timing, and interaction. And it's worth noting that there are other ways that opponent can get around these things. Right now, I think over-encumbered is a great answer because it stops all of the non-chill ways your opponent attacks, right? Because at its core, Dredge is an aggro attacking deck, and Hollow One, Icarid, Narcomoeba, and the cards that come back from the graveyard are all creatures. This over-encumbered is covering a very large amount of the opponent's way to win the game. If you are above 12 health, you can't die to the 4 creeping chills in the deck if you have an over-encumbered and your opponent doesn't have a way to pay for the attack. And so a card like this that covers multiple axes, this is actually covering all of the graveyard creatures and the hollow ones, but not covering chills. So cards that cover multiple axes are invaluable, or more valuable, I should say, in combating Dredge. But you don't want to get caught, unaware of what the Dredge decks in the metagame are doing, because just because over-encumbered is very good against the current version of Dredge with the current suite of interaction doesn't mean that the Dredge players don't have any options. I have already seen some interesting choices from Dredge players in terms of how to combat this over-encumbered. Because this propaganda effect heavily relies on your opponent not being able to crack the clue and food token, maybe the Dredge player can sideboard in a Tolarian Academy, which makes 1 mana for every artifact, and then start cracking those clues and food tokens and eventually unlock the combat phase again. Or the opponent can play a different version of Dredge. There are, most Dredge decks nowadays look exactly like these cards that you're seeing over here, a bunch of 4-ofs of almost these exact cards. But that's not the only way you can play Dredge. You can play a Dredge deck that's more reliant on the graveyard, and it plays cards like Dread Return that will bring back Grizzlebrands and churn through the deck to return Thassa's Oracle. And so if you're relying on over encumbered to stop the attack phase and your opponent wins outside the attack phase, that's just another layer to this kind of cat and mouse game that is Dredge versus Dredge hate. I think this is a pretty good job of covering everything. Like I said, the main concepts here that I wanted you to take away are what are the ways that Dredge plays the games and what are the avenues you can attack. There's Bazaar of Baghdad and its activated ability as a land. There is the creature aspect, attacking all of the Dredge creatures need to basically attack you. And then, of course, there's the graveyard aspect of stopping the graveyard in various different ways. It's important to note that all these timing windows are very impactful. If you have the Soul Guide Lantern in play, you can wait until there's a bunch of triggers from a Dredge that makes this the most valuable. You need to wait maybe until, I see that there's a Narcomoeba trigger and this Narcomoeba is going to bring back the prized amalgam. So now I think it's the best time to get maximum value. I'll crack my Soul Guide Lantern. And all of these things, come with the fact that you have various mana costs here from 0 that doesn't even go on the stack and before the game, and it goes into play before the game even starts, to actual 0 but going on the stack, 1, 2, and so on and so forth. And their viability as Dredge hate is going to be greatly impacted by how early you can play them, what your opponent already has when you play them. But we said a Grafdigger's Cage might not really do anything if your opponent already has a bunch of creatures in play. Just like playing a Containment Priest might not do anything if your opponent's hand contains a bunch of hollow ones. I hope that has shed some light on the different ways that you can play against the Dredge decks, and it probably helps the Dredge players who watch this video as well on different ways you can combat the cards people are bringing in to beat you. If you have any follow-up questions or you think I missed any kind of major concepts or points, make sure you comment below. Let me know. I want to have this video as a bookmark that I can link to anyone who is confused about how you might want to play and sideboard against Dredge. I hope you enjoyed this episode of Voice of Vintage. More vintage content on this YouTube channel every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. I'll see you then.